Hello, I'm Ruth Livingston, and I'm going to teach you how to paint a birch's picture in watercolor. So of the materials that you need to have watercolor paper. And watercolor paper is different from regular paper in that wood pulp paper, if you try and paint on it, the water just sits on the top and kind of puddles. Watercolor paper is made from rag, and it absorbs water. So one of the first things you have to do if you're going to paint in watercolor is to get the paper and tape it onto a support like this. You have to tape all the way around to make certain that it's held properly. And what that will do, aside from giving you a nice border at the end, is that it will mean that the paper will dry flat. So that's an important start. You need your brushes. If you're right-handed, you want your brushes on the right, and your paint and water there as well, and your coffee or water that you're going to drink on the other side, and obviously reversed if you're left-handed. And the reason for that is it's very easy to dip the brush into the coffee if it's sitting right beside the water. So, like that. For this lesson, you're going to need an old credit card or gift card that no longer is you're using. You need a couple of containers for water. I like to use small glass containers. These are from Yortzeit candles. If you're ever wondering what to do with those once the candles are burnt down, they make perfect water containers. You'll need a palette of some sort. So these are inexpensive palettes that you can get. So we're going to do a birch tree. For this exercise today, I'm going to do one, but you can do more on your page depending how big you're working and how big the tape is that you're going to use. We're using the tape as a resist to hold the space white. If you don't do that, if you try and just paint on each side and sort of have the tree drawn in, it won't be smooth on each way. So this way the sky comes down very nice and smoothly, and it's critical to be able to do that in one go so that the color is nice and smooth and it dries evenly. So I'm going to use the tape for a tree. I'm going to angle mine slightly in, like that. Before I do any painting, I'm going to mix in my wash. So the wash is made a couple of drops into the center. You take up as much of the paint as will fit on your brush. You put it in like this. And once it's mixed with the water, you're going to use a small swatch, a small piece of watercolor paper, and you're going to test. So this is the wet color. It will dry to half that value. It won't be as dark as it is. So if it's not enough color for what you want to show, then you can add some more color into it. One of the glasses that you're going to use, the water containers, you're going to use to clean your brush. And when you're done with cleaning it, you're going to lay it flat on either your paper towel or towel and let it dry flat. You do not want to do it up like this, because if you do that, eventually the glue inside is going to dissolve and you're going to wind up losing bristles onto your painting. I'm going to use my wash brush. I like using a mop. It holds a great amount of color and a great amount of water. When you put it into the clean water, you're always going to be picking up from clean. You don't want it so that it's dripping wet like that. That's too much. We're not working large because at the beginning it's easier to get used to managing the water if you're working a little bit smaller. This is maybe 8 by 10 or 12 inches, this paper. So what I'm going to do is put the water down first. It's going to go tape to tape, not part way. You want to go right over the tape, because if you don't do that, you're going to come back in after and touch it. It's going to create a mark on your painting. You're not going to be happy with that. So get used to right from the beginning doing this. So from the top, overlapping slightly, and just work your way towards yourself. You're going to go down about 2/3 of the page. It's nicer to do that. It gives you a better feel for how it looks. It's more pleasing to the eye if you work in thirds. If you work something right down halfway, it's not as interesting to look at. That's why the tree is over on one side. If you wanted more trees, you could put them like this and like that. So while this is wet, I'm going to soak up my wash, as much of it as I can get into my brush. And then I'm going to start again at the top, tape to tape, going smoothly across, slight overlapping. You can see how it's getting very light at the bottom. This is a graded wash, and that's just fine. You're not going to start over. You're not going to put more paint on it or more water on it or anything. Let's say that you've got a bit of a puddle happening on your page. What you would do is you would tilt it this way, and you would, on the tape, sort of squeeze it like this, just at the edge, and that would pick up that extra water. You would do the same down here, so that just along the edge, not onto the paper, or you'll get a mark. So that's your first wash. And it took me a while to master getting it nice and smooth like that. If you wind up with something on the page, like a little speck of extra paint or something winds up, leave it there until it's dry. Then you can brush it off and you can paint a branch over top of it so it won't bother you when you look at it after. So the next thing we're going to do, this is wet in wet. I'm going to do a wet on dry. So I'm leaving the bottom of the paper dry because I want it to have some texture. I don't want it as smooth as on the top. It's nice to have the contrast. So I'm going to start with some yellow. I'm just going to put it right onto that. I'm going to get some green. Now this part, it doesn't matter if you paint back and forth over it because you want that texture. You want it to look a little different. So that would be that first background now done, and your foreground is done. Now for the purposes of the lesson, I'm going to switch to a new piece of watercolor paper because this isn't going to be dry for a little while. At home, if you have a hair dryer, you can use that to make it dry. I would go side to side carefully, over top, not too close. If it's very wet, it might blow the paint a little bit. You can see how it's a little bit heaved up. That's because the watercolor paper has absorbed that water and it's still damp. When it's dry, it's going to be more flat. The other thing is, if you're close to dry and you're not positive and you're ready to start doing something else on the picture, if you touch it lightly, it should feel room temperature. If it feels cool, it's still got some damp in it. So I'm going to switch this to one that's already got that dry on it. Okay. So that's this page. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add the branches to the tree. So for that, I'm going to use my liner. If you don't have a really narrow liner, use the brush that has the best point in your collection of brushes. And just lightly using the tip in the color would be sufficient. So I'm going to... Now you don't want your dark color, your black, to be very thick or too watery. You just, with this, if you just put water on your brush and then swirl it into your black paint, it's probably sufficient. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to put a branch. Now this is the part I love best about doing trees, is that it's very meditative. So it doesn't matter which direction you go, as long as you're light at the end and heavier at the tree, which is how the twigs would come off. They would be much lighter than what you're seeing there. You don't want them to all be, I have a habit of painting all my brushes at 45 degrees. You want to vary how they come off the tree. It's more interesting. Again, those odd bits are what add interest to the visual part of the painting. And you can go right off the page. Doesn't matter. Painting branches is cool. Okay, that'll do for now. Clean the brush, lie it down flat. Now this is one of the things, you can use your round to do this, where you dip it into the paint and then you just go plunk, 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 like that. Just add the paint on sort of where you want your leaves. But with the mop, this is one of the things I like to do, is I pull the bristles apart a little. I'm going to pick up some color, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm just going to add it to sort of the tips, like that. Maybe there'd be some in here. And then take out some, go and get some green. I'm using colors as if it's sort of the beginning of the summer, which is what it is here at this time. So something just to think about when you're starting. So like that. So you would do your leaves on the edges. You can put as many as you want. I'm going a little light this time rather than a whole bunch. Another thing you can do is you can add trees in the background, which is kind of neat. So I have another brush, which I didn't mention before. This is an straight edge. It gives you kind of a nice effect when you paint with it. So I'm going to get some green. I'm going to put... Now, this tree is in the background of the birch, so it doesn't matter. When I use the tape, I know that that's going to keep my birch tree. So if I do one like this, then it's in behind. When you look at evergreens, they have a kind of a distinct shape. They're vaguely triangular, but they're not solid. You see all of these spaces in between the branches. So that's really important to do. And if it doesn't look exactly like the picture, it doesn't much matter because it gives you the impression. And that's another thing about painting. You paint close up, but when you want to see how it looks, you have to back up and look at it at a distance because you don't otherwise get the feel of what you're seeing. So you paint close, look at a distance. It's like when you go to the art gallery. The only reason you're going to come up close to the painting on the wall is to see how they did something, how they got a particular effect. Otherwise, you're looking at it from a bit of a distance. So that's one type of tree you can do at the back. The other would be sort of like branches. You're coming up and you do sort of the same thing you did on making the branches with little twigs. You could do one back. The closer, if you're painting down at the bottom of the sheet, it will look closer to you. If you're painting further back, further up the sheet, then it looks in the distance. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing we did with the leaves. And basically the same kind of color if you want, or you can change it a little bit. I actually kind of like the way that looks. I'm going to leave it like that. You can layer on, and you'll discover when this dries, you may have to add several layers to make it look the way you want, because here it looks like all the branches are towards me and the leaves are behind. So I may add, probably using the round, I may add a little bit more solid color on top, just so that it's sort of not all pale and behind. You can't know how that's going to look until it dries. You see the brush is not in a point now, so I get that nice sort of odd leaf look to it. Yeah, that's a little better. So you can keep layering until, you know, like you're not seeing the actual branches or points all the time. Now comes the part when I teach this with kids, this is the part they love the best, is to deal with the tree trunk. So I'm going to take my tape off the tree. I'm going to assume that this is dry enough to work. Now, you're not going to just rip it off. This painter's tape lifts very easily. But like if you're using masking tape and you do that, you're liable, if there's any damp on the side of the tape, you're liable to rip into your picture. If that does happen, you can use glue stick later and just on the bottom of the part where it pulled up, and you can glue it back down. But it's much easier to take that couple of seconds and just do it carefully. I would say if you're working somewhere where it's wet, you want to keep your other finger right close, your other hand, with your forefinger just there. If it does start to rip, you can just press it down and keep going. So there's my birch tree. So this is the fun part. Now comes the old credit card. So for this I use my round, or I would use the flat brush. And I would take a little bit of the black paint. I'm going to paint it along the edge. Now you can see it's not got a huge amount of water. It's got a little bit, but not a huge amount. This is something else that takes practice. So I would suggest if you do it on your swatch first, so let's say I'm going to do that, I'm going to put this here. I'm going to pretend this is my tree. I'm going to line it up on the edge, and I'm going to pull it like this. Hardly any mark at all. So maybe it needed a little more. There we go. So that would be the type of thing you're trying to do. So practice it so you don't have it too wet or too dry, and then you're ready to go on your tree. So again, I'm going to paint down here along the edge. I'm going to start at the top. I'm right-handed, so I'm starting on the left side of the tree, and I'm going to pull that, line it up right along the edge and pull it over. And I'm just going to work my way down the tree trunk. I learned this trick from Leona Brown many, many years ago. I've painted a lot of birches since then. You can do some from the other side as well if you want. If you wind up going off the side, you just paint in a branch there. So like this, I went a little off, so I'm just going to put a branch. Unlike acrylic, you can't really fix watercolor the way you can with acrylic and paint over, so what you would have to do is just find a way to solve that. So if you had a spot of a hair or something, that your branch would have to come across that after you took it off when it was dry. So I would call this painting pretty much done. You can add things in the foreground. You can put grasses and so on. I'll put a couple just to show you. It's kind of a neat thing. If you have a liner, I would say, okay, so I'm just going to come in from here, and I'm just going to go, so you put it down, say on the edge of the tape, and flick. If it were too wet, of course, you'd wind up with droplets. I don't know how well you can see this. This one isn't very wet because it's sort of pulling, so you get kind of a line that's broken. So it needed a little more water still. And like everything when you're painting, composition comes into play. So you don't want everything the same height. You want to have some differences there. You can add some texture. You can sort of make it one of those kind of weeds or whatever that has a little bit of bloom on it. You can come, obviously, if you're going to have grasses or whatever, they can come right across the front. That would mean it would be closer to you than the bottom of the tree. It's all good. So that's the last thing that you're going to be doing, is you're going to take that liner or the tip of your round, and some of these branches, they're not all going to be going to the back of the tree, right? Some of them are going to come from in front. So this one I'm going to put here, and I'm going to paint it this way so that it's coming from the front of the tree. And this one also, I think. And I'm just going to put a little more green back here. Like that. There are different effects you can do as you practice. If you're doing a winter picture, you would have much less in terms of, you're not going to have foliage showing at all. And you can just leave the branches bare. It's a nice way to practice. And here's those little trees along the ridge. It's nice to have not exactly flat at the horizon line. If you have something like that, it adds a little visual difference, which makes it more pleasing. So this picture, I did it with a wash at the bottom as well. And when I came up from the bottom, it was still a bit damp here where they met. So it moved, and when it dried, it had this lovely line as if it were hills or bushes or something in the background. And these are just loosely painted in bushes, as you can see. This trick here is lifting out. We'll do that another time. But this is probably one of my favorite of all the birches that I've painted. I really like how this one worked out. So anyway, we're done. Okay, so we're going to take the tape off just so you can see what it looks like, the picture with the without the distracting green tape. And again, if it's dry, you don't have a problem taking it off quickly like this, but if it is at all wet, it might rip, and so you have to be a little bit cautious with how you lift it. Actually, this way. So this is the finished picture. hope you enjoyed the class.